Well, for more, we can cross now to Washington and speak to Andrea Stricker, who is the Deputy Director of the Non-Proliferation Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Andrea, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just picking up on what we were saying in the introduction, what do you think the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would have been trying to convince President Trump of yesterday at their talks at the White House?
Well, great to join you, Tom. I think Netanyahu was likely talking to Trump about what may happen if he does strike. I think he is also pushing the president to be very careful about making a bad deal with the Islamic Republic. So those two top items, what happens if he does decide to use military force and the negotiations fail, but also this backup concern of his that Trump may be compelled to make a deal that the Islamic Republic will flout, will not agree to ultimately execute over time, and will likely use to just wait out Trump's time in office.
Right, just listening to what President Trump has said in terms of postings he's put out on social media, I mean, it does sound like dialogue for the time being is his preferred course of action. I mean, after all, the US had a nuclear deal with Iran before, and I'm just wondering, I mean, if a deal can be struck, what needs to be different this time around?
This time around, the president really does need to go back to his original demand for the full, total dismantlement under international verification of Iran's nuclear weapons program and pathways. So all remaining facilities, they would need to declare all of their past nuclear weapons work. They would need to restrain their long-range missile program and dismantle that as well. And then they'd also have to deal with funding terrorism and in reversing the horrible oppression and executions and torture of their people. So I think these demands are likely too tall for this regime. I think they would actually likely rather go to war than have to comply with those.
Okay, let's talk about what Iran has by way of a nuclear threat. What's Iran got in terms of highly enriched uranium stockpiles? And could the country already, in your opinion, be in a position to build one or more devices?
Well, thanks to the US and Israeli strikes in June 2025, the program has severe bottlenecks and choke points in the pathway to nuclear weapons. I'd say they were set back about 2 years, if not further. What we've really seen them do is try to start to look at what might have survived the strikes at the below ground sites. They haven't touched really the Fordow enrichment site, which was the main facility under a mountain that President Trump struck. But they do have around 10, 11 nuclear weapons worth of this highly enriched uranium, which can be used directly in a nuclear device. So far, they likely have not been able to get to that. It's buried in tunnels at Esfahan that the US had struck, as well as in the Fordow facility. And so they really don't have much to bargain with at the moment because they themselves don't have access to the HEU.
Right, and you've probably seen the various reports and the satellite photographs that are doing the rounds. I'm just wondering what looks and sounds notable, what the main takeaways are when you've looked at those reports and those satellite images of what's left of the nuclear sites that were operated there.
There's a few key sites of concern. One is a facility that the US did not strike, but is even more deeply buried than Fordow under a different mountain near the Natanz facility. And the Iranians were making a new centrifuge assembly plant, but there's enough space in that facility, likely based on the thermal imagery and other imagery, that shows that it could house a secret enrichment plant. And so perhaps President Trump, when he was speaking to NBC News last week, was talking about new activity at that site. They've continued to construct it, and that raises alarm bells because that would flout the president's red line that they not resume enrichment. And then anything that they would be doing to get at the HEU, particularly where it was stored in the Esfahan tunnels, would be concerning. We've also seen them really try to close up the entrances in case of a strike. So they're actually using these weeks of negotiations to try to fortify their facilities just in case.
Right, we'll come back to that in a moment because I wanted to ask you whether you think, in fact, both sides potentially are buying time at the moment. let's just be cautious for a moment. I mean, supposing there were a massive change of leadership in Iran, supposing there was considerable upheaval, would you have concerns about the stockpiles that Iran might already have potentially falling into the wrong hands? I mean, the security of those stockpiles wouldn't be at all certain, would it, if Iran were to enter a phase of serious domestic turmoil?
That's an important point, and I know other colleagues are concerned about it, particularly the Bushehr nuclear reactor, where any effort to not maintain the facility could result in a meltdown, and that would spread radiation across the region. And then those HEU stockpiles, while they are deeply below ground most likely, they may be a prized asset for any terrorists or rogue elements of a former Iranian regime that might want to get to it and sell it on the black market. And then there's also radioactive sources throughout civilian nuclear sites and hospitals in Iran. And those could pose an immediate risk to people nearby if they were not secured. So I think the US and the international community do need to be planning contingencies to try to secure these facilities or work with remaining forces on the ground to ensure that they remain secure in the event of a collapse of the regime.
Right. I mean, whether or not regime change is the intended outcome of the United States here. I mean, it's never been attempted before, has it, as far as I'm aware, in a country with stockpiles of uranium like the ones that Iran has?
Well, in the Iraq case, so nearby in Iraq, when the U.S. invaded in 2003, there were major concerns. There were some nuclear materials on the loose and radioactive sources that the U.S. Ultimately had to secure. This has also been the case in the former Soviet Union, where there was serious concern that nuclear weapons and nuclear materials could be on the loose if security did not cooperate. So the U.S. really did funnel a lot of money and program efforts to secure those. And hopefully they're thinking through contingencies like that and how they could be proactive.
Just briefly, there was a report put out by Turkish officials saying that the United States, their understanding is the United States might tolerate Iranian enrichment within clearly defined boundaries. Does that sound credible to you?
I would be surprised if President Trump would allow them to have enrichment, but there was a proposal back in May 2025 before the strikes where Steve Witkoff apparently had suggested a drawdown of enrichment where Iran could enrich at a low level for a few years before ultimately joining and putting in its enrichment in a regional consortium. It's my hope that that kind of a proposal is not back on the table, because I think the Iranians would simply wait out Trump and then resume enriching to higher levels and extorting the international community and its neighbors by using that material for all sorts of concessions.
Okay, so for the second time, you seem to be making the implication that Iran is merely trying to buy time. So just to clarify, you don't think Iran is at all sincere about striking a meaningful deal at this point?
I don't think so. They have seemed to offer concessions, but then another official the next day will walk it back and say, no, that's a red line for us as far as turning over our enriched uranium or halting enrichment or even talking about the missile program. And that's not even touching on the repression of the people. We seem to have done a 180 and completely moved away from the issue of executions, which are continuing behind closed doors. So I think the Iranians ultimately cannot make a deal on this because of their ideology and because of their resistance nature. And I think that the supreme leader would rather go to war ultimately. And if he does make a deal, it's going to be something very superficial that simply would allow both sides to take a break and take a breath before going back perhaps for another conflict in the future.
I mean, Andrea, is there an argument, just reading between the lines, looking at yesterday's meeting, slightly unusual meeting at the White House, you know, closed door meeting, Prime Minister Netanyahu went through sort of a back door as opposed to the more ceremonial front door of the White House. I mean, is there an argument the US is buying time? After all, President Trump has floated this idea of sending another aircraft carrier attack squad to the region. I mean, could that be where we're heading? The US is buying time with a view to having the element of surprise on its side.
Absolutely. I think that's the more likely scenario, that Trump thought that perhaps calling the Iranian people to protest would lead to the collapse of the regime. But then he was quickly warned by advisors in regional countries that he doesn't have the military assets in place to defend against an Iranian attack if he were to strike them. So what we've seen over the past month or so is the U.S. really encircling the regime and getting all those defensive and offensive assets in place in case the president does decide to strike. I think he's given them this last window of diplomacy to make a deal, but I don't see that working out. And I think ultimately he will be forced to make good on his red lines and do some damage to this regime for all of its malign actions in the last several months.
Right. So on the one hand, this could be the US buying time with a view to having the element of surprise on its side. Another argument you're making here is that perhaps this is a box-ticking exercise, so the United States can say it did everything it possibly could to engage with Iran, and the Iranians simply weren't sincere. Do you think that's the argument we're going to hear at a later date? And that, you seem to be saying that military action of one kind or another is looking fairly inevitable.
It looks fairly inevitable, unless the president has been told that striking could lead to some kind of regional collapse or of the regime, would create upheaval for the whole region. In that case, he may be just delaying and trying to see what is possible with the deal. But he's in a hard position here, having said that the regime has to make a deal and it has to stop the executions, and they're not doing either one.
Right, and Iran all the while is sort of calling quite a lot of the shots, and yet there's this convergence of events and factors that really don't seem to suggest Iran has a huge amount of bargaining power. There's the fact that Iran has got considerably weakened regional influence through its proxies in the region, not least Syria, which is no longer necessarily an ally, domestic unrest. These factors might not converge again for a very long time. And I wonder whether President Trump's advisors will be telling him that if we don't do something now, the opportunity simply won't present itself again in the near future. Do you think that's the sort of advice President Trump is receiving?
I think that's right. He's likely hearing differing views from the Rubio camp, who is more on that side, that this is a historic opportunity. We've just had success in Venezuela, and we had success during Operation Midnight Hammer in June against Iran. And perhaps they're thinking of creative ways to topple the regime, or at least take out the top echelons of people. And so I think he also, though, will be hearing from his base on the more far right, which is nervous about U.S. intervention. And so I think that is why he's actually framing this as Iran failing to meet the U.S.'s previous demands on the nuclear, missile, and terrorism front. So by not making it all about rescuing the Iranian people, he makes it more about the threat to America and to the region. And that helps him domestically. That helps him make the case if he does decide to take military action. And it makes it more of an America first approach.
Okay, just to wrap up this conversation, Andrea, just to conclude, your view, what's looking more likely at this stage? The United States strikes or the US folds?
I think we're going to see President Trump come through with a strike. Whether that is a regime toppling strike remains to be seen. He may do some damage as far as their missile capabilities, their military command and control, and other military assets. If he starts to go into the economic zone, striking oil facilities or oil ports, that may lead to a regime collapse. We will have to see how far he's willing to go. He may kind of take one step and then see what happens and decide whether he wants to go further. But I would expect that something like a strike is ahead.
All right, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Andrea Stricker, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to William Alberque, who is former director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Center. He joins us from Berlin. William, great pleasure having you on the program, as always. Let's just talk, first of all, about those discussions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump yesterday at the White House. Why do you think Netanyahu took this step of flying over there to talk to the president. What do you think he was trying to persuade him to do?
I think he was probably trying to persuade the United States to maintain maximum pressure and possibly to even go ahead and strike Iran. You'll recall that before the June strikes that Israel started in Iran, there had been some interesting negotiations between the US and Iran and Oman that looked like they were really making progress towards some kind of deal. And it looked like Netanyahu used the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors decision in June that Iran was likely, or that they couldn't rule out that Iran was moving towards a nuclear weapon to strike, also disrupting the US negotiations. And then that was so successful that then the US continued on with those military strikes. So I think with the fear that Iran and the United States might come to an agreement, Netanyahu would much rather further military action against Iran.
Right. I mean, at the moment, just listening to what the president's been saying and writing on social media, dialogue seems to be the preferred course of action. And yet, at the same time, as you've been saying and others have been telling us, Israeli officials urging him not to trust Iran, not to believe its promises. I mean, do you think a deal will be reached? And do you think it would be advisable for President Trump to try to reach one?
It's so difficult to predict. Iran's negotiating strategy to date has just been an appalling failure. I mean, brinksmanship, delay, and this really doesn't work with Trump. Trump would rather get some kind of rhetorical agreement and then work out the details later. Instead, Iran wants to front load all the details and delay and obfuscate. And it's just been a recipe for disaster so far. So you really can't tell. But on the other hand, striking a couple of nuclear facilities is one thing. Overthrow of the Iranian government or fundamentally destroying all of their nuclear capabilities, that's a much longer military campaign. I'm sure the US would rather avoid that. But with one aircraft carrier in the region, the USS Lincoln, and now Trump threatening to send another aircraft carrier, which would likely be the George H.W. Bush, which right now is in Virginia. It would take around 10, maybe 14 days to get into the region. Plus with the US global reach with its heavy bombers, it's a real threat. And unfortunately, that's the right negotiating strategy, putting Iran under pressure before you go into negotiations. The optics of Israel visiting Washington can't only but help put pressure on Iran to come to some deal. But they have to just stop this obfuscation and delay, and everything takes 3 weeks, and they come to some minor decision. They have to go back to Tehran. That's just not going to work at this point. It doesn't work with Donald Trump. And so there's a real risk of strikes coming up.
Right. So it sounds to me like you think perhaps Iran is, to some extent, playing games here and trying to buy a bit of time.
That's true. I mean, you have to remember, before the strikes, one of the reasons the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors judged that they could no longer prove that Iran wasn't going for a bomb. They had accelerated their enrichment of 60% enriched HEU. And really, anything past 20%, and you are so close to having a bomb. And we're talking about now, at the last measure, 440.9 kilograms. That's enough for more than a dozen nuclear weapons within weeks if they were able to complete enrichment and turn that into a useful nuclear device. So Iran was really playing a dangerous game before the bombing. And now we don't know where the uranium is. Iran has blocked IAEA inspections to be able to locate and account for all the material. So it's a bad situation. And really, I think Iran should just come to a deal, let the details be worked out between the two sides, but agree. And that's why I think the president of Iran, I think it was today, said that he would allow some sort of IAEA verification. I think that may be a sign that they're trying to put some concessions on the table. But ultimately, they still have to agree to the venue and the date for talks. I have some hope. And again, watching the US ramp up the pressure, Iran making some concessions as we go into this, maybe they can come to a deal. There really is a deal space if the sides want it.
So what you're saying is that, and what we've been reading is that Iran has got these stockpiles of enriched uranium, and they've got enough of it to build a device. Who knows? I mean, could they have perhaps already built one? In which case, isn't the discussion of how to prevent an Iranian nuclear program slightly futile at this stage?
I don't think they have a viable device. If they had, the problem is if they actually crossed that threshold and built one nuclear weapon, their window of vulnerability is massive because they would have to build the weapon in secret. They'd have to find a delivery system. Now they have plenty of missiles that can deliver that, but they have to mount it. And then what are they going to do? Launch one nuclear weapon or threaten to launch one nuclear weapon? That would invite the US, with a lot of global support, by the way, to bomb the heck out of Iranian facilities and destroy any possibility of anything like that happening, and even bring about the specter of regime change. If they cross that threshold, that actually opens up a window of opportunity. If they were really going to proliferate, if they were really going to build nuclear weapons, they would need time and space to be able to build a number of them so that they could declare that they had a viable arsenal. So I do honestly think that there is some negotiation to be had here. But again, Iran has the capability, they have the knowledge. They're still building additional facilities to be able to hide these things. And so they would have to declare a level of transparency and openness to inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency, assurances to the United States, and stop this approach of trying to get away with everything they can get away with in order for what they thought was leverage, but actually is vulnerability. I do think there's a deal space, but it's going to have to be under strict international safeguards from now on, with no more obfuscation, no more games. Ironically, it's going back to something like the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran deal, only stronger with more verification, probably without time limitations like that agreement had. And ultimately, I think the Gulf states have to be comfortable with any deal because, as you know, Iran has been disrupting the region, funding separatist movements, funding terrorism, giving missiles to separatist groups. A lot of that also has to be addressed, because in the long term, you're going to need a regional security stability arrangement that gives Iran some assurance that they won't be overthrown, at the same time prevents them from doing all the damage and killing all the people that they've killed in the Middle East. It's very complex negotiation, but for now, let's see if we can get a nuclear deal done with real verification and transparency, with real limits that Iran honors, and go from there. Otherwise, it's going to be strikes and it's going to be uncertainty, and we'll see, what kind of turmoil that unleashes.
Yeah, and if it is strikes and uncertainty, I mean, one of the uncertainties, just listening to what you're saying as well, that occurs to me is those enriched uranium stockpiles. I mean, is it dangerous? Are there hazards attacking a country that has stockpiles like this? And then as an extension of that question, trying to seek regime change in a country where there are these stockpiles, I mean, isn't there a terrible danger here that those stockpiles end up in the wrong hands?
So, yes, I mean, there is a danger. What we're talking about is enriched uranium hexafluoride gas that then has to be turned into salts and then into metal and then into a sphere that you put in the center of a bomb that you can detonate. There's a couple of technical steps that I think Iran understands the technical challenge to, and they can overcome. But if you were to, now we suspect that the actual containers with this enriched uranium may be buried under rubble. Some of them, according to IAEA reports, may have been moved off-site to another location. As to whether they're also buried at that site, we just don't know. So the location of that material is a number one concern. And the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has demanded that Iran fulfill its safeguards obligations, its treaty obligations, and tell the IAEA where this material is, and they've refused to do so. So the first threat is that this material itself could now be vulnerable to theft, or as you point out, if US strikes occur, that it could be destroyed. Now, there is no threat except in the immediate area of the actual uranium storage containers of breathing it in, but it's not going to cause some Chernobyl-like event. It's not going to explode and cause a nuclear fission. That's not to be feared. But yeah, if you're in the room when one of these things it gets explodes, you're going to have a bad day. You're probably not going to live through that. But if you're 10 miles away, if you're 5 miles away, you're going to be okay. So the U.S. may prioritize destroying any containers with this uranium. It would be much better if Iran just declared them. As to your rate, I mean, if Iran does cross the nuclear threshold and has a number of actual nuclear weapons, then that's a huge danger, because what are they going to do with those nuclear weapons? They could use them for terrorism. They could proliferate them to other states, et cetera. That's why we don't want them to cross that threshold. And quite frankly, I would much rather they were disarmed from this material now The longer term problem is that they've already gone through the intellectual exercise. They've developed the capabilities and expertise and technologies. So without real safeguards in the future, they could do this again. They could negotiate away what they've already enriched and then just wait and then build secret facilities, which, we know that they've constructed additional ones that have not been bombed, and move material and technologies in there and do this again. And that's why you're going to need, like I said, really, really strict safeguards and verification to prevent them from doing this again. And what will Iran ask for in return for that? Openness, trade, reintegration into the global economy, and that's going to require them behaving on a regional basis. So that's why, again, this is a really complex situation. But I wouldn't be afraid of a nuclear release occurring now. I don't think there's any threat of a major, nuclear radiation incident unless the U.S. decides to strike one of Iran's nuclear power reactors. But I don't think we'll do that. I think if there are strikes, they're going to concentrate on leadership, on air defenses, on missile capabilities, and possibly going after where we think this nuclear material might be stored.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. But thank you very much for sharing that with us, William Alberque. Thank you very much for your time, sir.